The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie, the Audible original version, starring Toni Collette, Kit Harington, and a full cast. I'm not going to be a gatekeeper and make you wait until the end for my conclusion. I'll just come out and tell you this is bad. So bad. Why? Okay, before I begin the review proper, I'll start off by saying that I know the story well. I've read the book, I've listened to the unabridged recording with Richard E. Grant, I've listened to the BBC dramatisation umpteen times, I've seen the BBC's Joan Hickson adaptation, with a dull-looking cast, as well as the ITV version with Geraldine McEwen several times. In short, I know this story inside out. Despite this, I found this Audible version a confusing mess. Why? Well, like most Miss Marple stories, Miss Marple isn't the detective protagonist we're accustomed to, which is quite surprising. In the Poirot novels, he's front and centre, but Marple often doesn't appear until later in the books. Christie often spends quite a bit of time establishing the setting, the murder, and the various suspects before Marple becomes involved. The Murder at the Vicarage does feature her throughout, but the story is narrated by the vicar, Leonard Clement, so even here we're not seeing the investigation primarily through Marple's eyes. And obviously, when you decide to bring in a name like Toni Collette, you don't want to leave her sidelined and waste her talents. So, what do? You change the structure of the story. Instead of letting the story develop in a traditional linear format, it's told through a series of flashbacks. And so, rather than this being a Miss Marple story, it becomes a two-handed story with Marple and the vicar sharing ideas. At least some of the dialogue is faithful to the original, although I can't say exactly how much without doing a deep dive, reading the book while simultaneously listening to the adaptation. I do recognise some of the dialogue from the many times I've listened to the BBC radio version, but I know that there are additions. More on them later. But my gripe is that the structure is all wrong, and in fact the story just doesn't work well with this new arrangement. We don't meet characters organically, they're thrown together, so as a listener it takes longer than normal to get to know the new characters and, more specifically, the new voices. And that leads to the second huge problem, the casting. To say that it's stunt casting is not an exaggeration. Toni Collette is an excellent actress, but for this she is utterly wrong. When the adaptation was first announced, I was worried that getting this Australian actress to do this most English of parts would be a disaster, but her accent is almost flawless. Almost. She's so good in fact that the image I have in my head while listening to this is Emma Thompson, so her foreignness is not the problem. The problem is that Collette is a mere 54, a full decade younger than Miss Marple, and she sounds it, which is to say, she doesn't sound it. It's not just that she doesn't sound like someone in her 60s, but you have to bear in mind when this book was set, the 1920s and 30s. So a woman in her 60s back then was ancient, knocking on heaven's door, in fact. Think back to old family pictures of even the 1950s and 60s, and women over the age of 50 looked like they had one foot in the grave. And Toni Collette sounds positively youthful and vibrant. No amount of acting can disguise the fact that she has the vocal cords of a much younger woman. She's not the only one. At time of recording, Kit Harington is yet to turn 40, but the character he plays, the Reverend Clement, is in his 50s. In fact, part of the tension between him and his wife Griselda revolves around him being a good bit older. In this adaptation, he decries that his wife is yet to turn 30. Well, fine, because Kit himself is in his 30s, so the age gap isn't, and more importantly doesn't sound, big. In the world of the novel, set in the 20s or 30s, a man in his 50s would have been ancient by today's standards, but this adaptation hints at none of that. Ideally, for it to work today, they should have got an actor in his 60s to play this man in his 50s, not someone who is actually in his 30s. It's a bizarre choice. Anne Prothero should be in her mid-30s, but she sounds early 20s, as do Gladys Cram, Lettice Prothero, and Mary the maid, who should all be a good deal younger. The men fare no better, with Lawrence Redding, Hawes the curate, and Dennis Clement, the vicar's nephew, all sounding in their 20s, although Dennis mentions he is 16. It's all an absolute muddle. And then there's Mrs. Lestrange, or Mrs. Lestrange, as they insist on pronouncing it, and she's made out to be French, with the actress portraying her giving an abomination of a French accent. I won't say any more in case I spoil it, but Agatha Christie did not make her French, and there's no reason for her to be portrayed as such. Strangely, Inspector Slack calls her Mrs. Lestrange. Why didn't he just pronounce the word the English way? It's yet another thing this adaptation gets wrong. Let me be clear, the acting is actually fine. The problem is that these people simply don't sound as old as they should be. Chronological age is the ordinary age we normally mean when we say, for example, she's 65, whereas biological age is how old the body appears to be functioning. Miss Marple has a chronological age of, let's say, 65, while she's being played by a woman with a chronological age of 54 who has a biological age of 44. It just doesn't work. That, compounded with the non-linear storytelling, really hamstrings this adaptation. Because of the way it's told, we jump around between scenes rather than following them naturally, so we also don't learn to distinguish which voice is which. You do get to recognize the voices, but with the BBC adaptation it was instantaneous. Here it takes about 2 hours before you're familiar with who's talking, and there are awkward moments when Miss Marple asks the vicar to remind her about a conversation they had together just so that the scene can change to a few days ago. It's clunky to say the least. As with the Poirot adaptations Audible have so far butchered, this suffers from extended scenes and extended dialogue. Mary the maid is a lot stroppier than in the book, thanks to the extra dialogue she's lumbered with, and this adaptation suffers from those anachronisms that writers feel the need to shoehorn in these days, referring to some technology in a prescient manner.
I waved to him, then turned away.
Goodbye then.
Raymond had departed, but the village chemist was just setting out for St. Mary Mead. I walked beside him as he complained bitterly about the late running of local trains.
Oh, it's why so many are turning to these motor cars. What will become of our fresh country air if everybody drives?
Or things like this.
I said I'd leave with her, but she wouldn't hear of it. And now Susan Hartley Napier is saying lettuce has rotten manners.
It will all blow over, I'm sure.
I'd do anything for lettuce. We understand each other. She says I'm her BFF.
What does that mean?
Backup future fiancé.
It's just not necessary, and this adaptation is peppered with them. And my bugbear with the Poirot adaptations is front and centre here. The audio processing is done in Dolby Atmos, so the engineers have gone to town with the effects. They couldn't just present the audio in a straightforward manner, they had to add filters and effects. So when there are two people who are all talking in the same room, it sounds like one of them is having the conversation over 2 tin cans tethered together by a length of string, and the other person sounds like they're underwater. It's absolutely maddening. I had low expectations going into this, but it failed to even meet those. Overall, I have to give the dramatization a 1 out of 5 and a cast a 2 out of 5. They are not bad actors by any stretch of the imagination, but they are simply wrong for this, every last one of them. What about you? Have you listened to this or the other Agatha Christie adaptations by Audible? Let me know what you think of them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as I release a new review every week. Thanks for watching.